Hello there, my name is Funshaw. I'm a 3D character artist, and here's the skin texturing process for Tola. This is the part 2 of the Tola and Calcid character creation. Feel free to check out the part 1 if you haven't already. I covered the sculpting in that video. Oh well, let's get into it. The first thing I do after opening and importing my model into Substance Painter is changing the focal length. I can't stand how 35mm look on portraits, so I go close to the focal length I had in ZBrush, which was about 60mm, something like that. Next thing I do is go into the channels and add a scattering channel because it isn't there by default, and then I bake the mesh maps from the previously exported high poly model. I go for 8K for the baking so that I can export 8K maps. Good thing about Substance Painter is that I can export 2K or 4K maps as well. The most important maps for baking are the curvature and ambient occlusion maps. The normal map is important as well, but we've already extracted that from the ZBrush sculpt. You might have some artifacts from the ZBrush normal maps, so it doesn't hurt to bake the normal maps and any other maps as well, including the position and thickness. So after baking is done, I make sure to use heat insulated gloves to carefully remove the pies from the oven and wrong script. After baking is done, I make a layer and get ready for the texturing of the diffuse map or albedo or color or whatever you call it. The first thing you want to do is gather reference, of course. Like, you always have to gather reference. You can get some high resolution face photographs from Google or even the Texturing XYZ website. You would want to get the images in as much flat lighting as possible to avoid specular highlights. We're going to be color picking from these references, so it's good to get realistic looking images. After gathering my reference, I go into Substance Painter and hit C on my keyboard to go into base color painting mode. I then create a base color by eyedropping an even area on one of the images onto a fill layer. I then eyedrop a darker area following the reference and a lighter area as well. See, I don't know if you noticed, but the face doesn't have one even color skin tone. It's divided into regions, maybe close to the nose, close to the forehead, and in these regions you would have lighter or darker colors. The most important tip to getting good skin diffuse maps is to get variation in your painting. Now we can stay building upon each layer tediously, or we can, use a little cheating, You can do this by creating a paint layer and using one of the images as a stencil. This helps you map out the color regions as well as serve as a good base. The quality of the stencil doesn't really matter because it's a base and we just want to see the face regions I mentioned earlier. It would be in your best interest, to choose naturally lit images. After the projection is done, we can drop the opacity of the paint layer and continue to build upon it. This also makes it easier to eyedrop the textures directly from the face in Substance Painter. I use mainly dirt brushes and spot brushes to give good color breakups, and then I use light and dark layers as I've mentioned before, and then a vast range of layers in between to create the skin texture. Remember, variation is everything.
Rage on that beat, going crazy.
At a point where I feel satisfied with the texturing, I use the ambient occlusion and curvature masks to slightly get into the crevices and nooks of the sculpt and give some dark redness. I invert the mask, drop the opacity of these layers to as low as 19, and then change the blending mode to multiply. I then experiment with various spot brushes and any brush I can find, any brush I feel like, honestly, to add variation. Here I use a darker tone, blur it heavily, and then drop the opacity. I do the same with the lighter tone. I later come back to this file after I've rendered it to add some spots and pimples and then give those some bump with the high channel. After I'm happy with the diffuse, I put all those layers in one folder, title it diffuse, and then create a roughness folder. I start with a fill layer and then cycle to the roughness view using C on the keyboard. I then uncheck every channel from the fill layer except for the roughness and give a nice even roughness to the skin, something like 0.5, but we'll end up with something like 0.3. I then use one of the utility maps from the V-Face pack as a mask. There's one with distinct face regions that works really well for roughness. I then adjust the roughness values for both layers. Darker values equals a more glossy output. This can also be hand painted. Note that the roughness map doesn't really need to be that detailed. You just have to touch on the lips, the nose, and around the eyes, places that are usually glossy on the face. The next thing is the specular map. I create a folder for that as well. And this is just a habit of mine, but when I was doing it the first time, I ran into some complications exporting the specular map. I chose to export all my maps, hide and unhide it, and export the specular map in a separate folder as another diffuse map. So how that works is I create a white base layer and use one of the V-Face utility maps that looks like a cavity map as a mask for the second fill layer. This would then be filled in with pure black. Honestly, texturing XYZ is pretty useful. Alternatively, you can use the curvature mask that you baked earlier on and then mix that in with some tileable skin maps. In any method I use, I make sure to play around with the levels to get a nice contrasting black and white map. While painting, I noticed that the inner eyelids weren't painted in yet, So I dropped the appropriate color from my reference and painted that in. I then adjusted the opacity to help it blend in and changed the roughness value. The last folder I created was for the subsurface channel. I followed the same workflow I used for creating the roughness, but in this case I made the base layer very dark, almost black but not quite, and then the mask above it just slightly brighter, as the subsurface benefits from being more subtle than other maps. Remember to take into account the areas that would have more subsurface than others, like the lips and the eyes. After all this is done, I turn off the specular folder, as that's in the diffuse, and then I export the diffuse, roughness and scattering maps as 4K maps. I then turn on the specular map and export it as a diffuse into a separate folder to avoid overwriting the original diffuse map. I export this and the normal OpenGL map as 8K 16-bit maps for crisp details. I then place all my textures in a folder, ready to be used in Blender and Cycles. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this video. You can like and subscribe. I'll release part 3 regardless.